School resource management system through Get Help buying for schools, and we will continue to support the sector with the costs that they're facing.
That's great. Right, that ends questions. We now come to the Prime Minister, who's going to make a statement on CHOGM, G7 and the NATO summit. Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll make a statement about the NATO, G7 and Commonwealth summits held in Madrid, Schloss Elmau and Kigali, respectively. In the space of 7 days, I had the opportunity to work alongside more than 80 governments, nearly half the entire membership of the United Nations, and hold bilateral talks with over 25 leaders, ranging from the new presidents of South Korea and Zambia to the prime ministers of Japan and Jamaica, demonstrating the global reach of Britain's diplomacy and the value of our presence.
Important that we don't think our job is done. Putin would like nothing better than for us to lose our focus, for the grip of sanctions to weaken, for military aid to Ukraine to dry up, or for cracks to appear in the unity of Putin's opponents. So I welcome the progress made at the NATO summit last week and congratulate our good friends in Finland and Sweden for their formal invitation to join the NATO alliance. And of course Ukraine on securing their candidate status to join the European Union. I hope these processes can be concluded as quickly as possible to send a clear message to Putin that his war has permanently changed the European landscape, but not in the way that he planned. I also welcome the commitment to strengthen our collective deterrent capabilities. I've seen firsthand how British personnel are working with other NATO forces to ensure the collective shield that's protected us for 3/4 of a century remains as strong as ever. So welcome the agreement on the new NATO force model, ensuring over 300,000 conventional troops will be at high readiness across Europe. Can I ask the Prime Minister how this agreement will affect British military planning, and if he believes our extra commitments can be met given his cuts to UK troop numbers? The commitment made at the G7 of further financial support for Ukraine is also welcome, as are plans to help Ukraine with post-war reconstruction through an international conference. Mr. Speaker, there can be no clearer case that aid spending makes Britain more secure and prevents the need for military spending in the future, which demonstrates the folly in reducing our aid commitments at a time of global instability. I'm pleased that unity was on display at both the NATO summit and the G7 summit, but I am concerned about current unity within the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is a valuable and important institution for this country. It isn't just a symbol of our past, it's important for our future, providing us with influence in all parts of the world. But in recent years, there have been serious signs of strain. When many major Commonwealth countries abstained at the UN over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the summit should have been an opportunity to widen diplomatic coalition against Putin. Instead, the Prime Minister waged a divisive campaign against the Commonwealth leadership that ended up in a humiliating diplomatic failure, only illustrating his embarrassing lack of influence. Instead of investing in aid that strengthens the alliance, he's cut it. Instead of upholding the rule of law that should define the Commonwealth, he reneges on treaties that he's signed, undermining Britain's moral and political credibility when we need our word to carry trust. My fear is simple. The vacuum we leave behind will be quickly filled, not by those who share our values, but by those who seek to destroy them. We cannot let that happen in Ukraine. We cannot let that happen anywhere. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for the terms in which, broadly speaking, he has addressed the UK's recent diplomatic activity. Just a couple of points to come back on. He talks about the UK breaking international treaties, Mr. Mr. Speaker. Actually, that is, I don't know what he's talking about there, but he was talking about what we're doing in respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Then that is not what is happening, Mr. Speaker. We believe that our obligation, our prior obligation, which I would have thought he supported, is to the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That's what we're supporting. And actually, you know, he talks about the UK's ability to win people over. It was very striking, Mr. Speaker, in the conversations I had with leaders from around the world, how few of them, if any, raised the issue, Mr. Speaker, of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and how much, Mr. Speaker, people want to see common sense and no new barriers to trade. What the UK is doing is trying to reduce pointless barriers to trade, and you would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that he would support that. And on his points about the UK's contribution to NATO and to the new force model, and whether that is sustainable, I really suggest, Mr. Speaker, that members opposite should talk to the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg about what the UK is producing and what the UK is committing. It is colossal. We are the second biggest contributor to NATO. We're the second biggest contributor overall to support for the Ukrainians, Mr. Speaker, of 2.3 billion in military assistance alone. And what we're also doing, Mr. Speaker, is making sure that our armed forces are provided for the future with £24 billion in this spending review, the biggest uplift in defence spending since the Cold War. Defence spending now running at 2.3% of our national GDP, above the 2% target, Mr. Speaker. That is felt around the room in NATO. People know what the UK is contributing, and they are extremely grateful. What the UK also contributes to NATO, under the new force model, we will contribute virtually all our naval forces, Mr. Speaker, but we also, as he knows, we are the only country to contribute our strategic independent nuclear deterrent to NATO. And I still find it a sad reflection on the party opposite that at this critical time, when Vladimir Putin is very sadly using the language of nuclear blackmail, we are in a situation in which the principal party of opposition in this country still has 8 members on its front bench who voted to discard our independent nuclear deterrent, Mr. Speaker, including the shadow foreign secretary. So apart from that, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the terms in which the right honourable gentleman has responded.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Could I ask the Prime Minister, was there general agreement at all 3 summits that our fragile rules-based order is under threat, and strategically we've entered a profound era of geopolitical change? Could I commend the Prime Minister's efforts in Ukraine? It's a shame other NATO countries haven't lent as much as we've done. But could I commend or encourage the Prime Minister to go further and to secure a UN General Assembly resolution to create a humanitarian safe haven around that critical port of Odessa, so those vital grain exports can not only reach Europe, but also Africa and prevent famine there?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his point, particularly about grain exports, and as he knows, the work is being led by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The UK is doing a huge amount to support Mr. Speaker, but as I've told the House before, we may have to prepare for a solution that does not depend upon Russian consent, because that may not be forthcoming.
SNP Leader Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and welcome him back from his travels around Africa and Europe. And it's perhaps worth reiterating, Mr. Speaker, that all of us in this House reiterate our support for President Zelensky, for Ukraine, in their struggle against the war criminal Putin. Mr. Speaker, the scale and the depth of the challenge facing our global community is self-evident. War in Europe, the return of soaring inflation, rising interest rates, and a cost of living crisis that is punishing people in the pocket. We're not just faced with one crisis. This is an accumulation of crisis that needs, deserves and demands a collective response. We know that at moments like this, solutions can only come from a coordinated effort. Previous efforts during the 2007 financial crisis and the coordination during COVID demonstrate just that right across the world. And none of us should be in any doubt. The crisis we are now in is as very bit as severe and steep and deep as anything that we faced in the time of the financial crisis. But, Mr Speaker, so far, and I regret to say this, that the collective effort, that sense of urgency, has been badly lacking, particularly from organisations like the G7. The response has been far too slow and far too small. Prime Minister, it is obvious that the G7 outcomes are nowhere near enough to combat the cost of living crisis that we now face. So when can the public expect some leadership and some action? When will we see a coherent, coordinated and credible plan to increase energy supply, cap prices and drive investment to the global economy before recession becomes inevitable? Or is the plan really to delay until the winter, when things will only get worse? Leadership now in responding to supply shocks will allow us to fight inflation, or a failure to take appropriate action exposes all of us to longer-lasting inflationary risks. On Ukraine, can the Prime Minister perhaps go a little bit further and give us an outlook as to what we will do to make sure that we can get grain out of Ukrainian ports? 400 million people worldwide rely on Ukrainian food supplies. This is now not just about stopping war, it's about stopping famine too. And finally, I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree that of all these global efforts will only begin and will only work if there is trust between global leaders. Can the Prime Minister therefore explain that in this moment of many crises, how exactly breaking international law and threatening to start a trade war with our neighbours helps anyone?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, I think that he should look more carefully at what the G7 produced in terms of the plan to cap prices for oil and gas, and particularly to try to stop Putin profiteering as he currently is from his illegal war. And there is a plan. It's not. I won't pretend it's going to be easy, but we're doing as much as we can, and we're certainly taking a lot of other action, for instance, to help countries around the world with access to fertiliser that they need. And he's right to raise the issue, Mr. Speaker, of the 25 million tonnes of grain currently held hostage in Odessa. There is a plan to get that out. It's not easy, but if you look at the numbers, we are gradually getting more grain out of those Ukrainian silos back into Europe, back into Africa, and we will continue to do that. As for his final point, Mr. Speaker, about the UK and a so-called breach of international law, I really repeat what I said to the right honourable gentleman opposite. What the countries around the world see is the UK offering consistent leadership in the matter of standing up for the rule of law and standing up against Putin's aggression. And that is, I promise you, that is what has been raised with me in the last 10 days.
Mr. Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend for the leadership he's shown in this previous week, and welcome his commitment to our Royal Navy forces being part of NATO. As my Defence Security Committee on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly starts its investigation for the next 2 years into the Russian maritime threat, can I ask my honourable friend, does he see the ongoing support of the Royal Navy in the long term, and what conversation can he have with other NATO allies to increase their maritime support to this vital mission?
I thank my honourable friend, and I want to congratulate him, by the way, on his work for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which was mentioned to me at the summit. And I can tell him that the UK is leading the NATO alliance in providing for a new force model in our naval commitment, and we're trying to encourage others to do the same.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much. Indeed, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the right honourable member for Bournemouth, the Prime Minister will know that time is running out to get grain to the hundreds of millions of people who will be facing destitution and hunger, as the Secretary-General has warned. Could he tell us who is going to provide the security guarantees to Ukraine? Because the fear is, if you open a sea corridor, that the Russians will seek to use it to attack Odessa. And can he confirm that it is to Turkey that the world is looking to provide those guarantees so the grain can get out before the moment is lost.
Prime Minister.
Right, honourable gentleman is completely right. The Turks are absolutely indispensable to solving this, and they are doing their very best. I thank President Erdogan for the efforts that he is making. It does depend on the Russians agreeing to allow that grain to get out. The UK is offering demining facilities. We're offering insurance facilities for the vessels that will be needed to get the grain out, Mr. Speaker. But we will, if he's right about the urgency, we will increasingly have to look at alternative means of moving that grain from Ukraine if we cannot use the sea route, if we can't use the Bosphorus.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Before there was a shooting war in Europe, in the 1980s, does the Prime Minister accept that it was right for this country to spend 5% of GDP on defence? And if he does, why does he think it's adequate for us to spend only half that percentage by the end of this decade?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and he has campaigned on this issue for years. And I have to say that I think that we will have to spend more, and logically, Mr. Speaker, if you protract the commitments that we are making under AUKUS and under the Future Combat Aircraft System, we will be increasing our spending very considerably. What we want to do is to make sure that other allies are doing the same. And that is the most important. We want to see, and that's why Jens Stoltenberg is we hope, going to be setting a new target and allowing the whole of the alliance to increase their funding.
David.
Speaker, while the Prime Minister was talking about British values at 3 international summits, he was whipping Conservative MPs to vote to trash one of our greatest British values, the rule of law. And while the Prime Minister was talking about increasing defence spending, he is ploughing ahead with plans to cut the British Armed Forces by 10,000 troops. And while the Prime Minister was talking about the problem of global price rises, he is raising unfair taxes on millions of pensioners and families across our country. So, Mr. Speaker, we are facing a domestic economic crisis, a global security crisis, and the Prime Minister is facing his own political crisis. So can he tell the House what precisely is his plan to take our country forward?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to tell the right honourable gentleman that our plan is to help the people of this country, as we are, with the cost of living, with £1,200 coming into people's bank accounts since he's asked, Mr. Speaker, this month. Which we can do because of the sensible economic steps that we have taken in coming out of the pandemic, but then to build on a stronger economy, Mr. Speaker, with reforms to our planning, to our housing, to our transport, to our energy networks, we will take down costs for people up and down the country, Mr. Speaker, and continue to make this place the best place to live in and invest in the whole of our hemisphere. That's our plan for the country, and I commend it to it.
Read it.
Western purchases of Russian energy are paying for Putin's war. So will he redouble his efforts to make sure we invest in more production and output of oil, gas and electricity here to make our contribution to reducing Western dependence?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I think the UK can be very proud of the way that we have moved beyond hydrocarbons in so many areas, but we have to recognise the limits and the pace of what we've achieved, and we have to be less neuralgic about using our domestic hydrocarbons, particularly when the alternative is just to import them from abroad.
Chris Brown.
Mr. Speaker, it's 3,056 days since Putin started his illegal invasion of Ukraine, and we spent far too long turning a blind eye to what was going on there. So forgive me if I'm just a little bit impatient, even about what we have already achieved. I want to see a British industrial strategy to make sure we're making enough lethal weaponry to give to the Ukrainians so that they can win. I want to see a major diplomatic effort to make sure that Putin isn't going to make further inroads in Republika Srpska and Bosnia. I also want to make sure that we as a country are still as focused on the laundering of dirty Russian money through the City of London as we should have been 10 years ago.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, the UK led the way in Europe in supplying weaponry to Ukraine. The end laws were of great importance, Mr. Speaker, and when it comes to sanctions, I think the UK again, we have a new economic crime bill coming in that will help us to clamp down further. But what we have done already is very, very considerable. And the squeeze is being felt by Putin and his economy, and we will continue to apply it. And I think he asked for a long-term strategy. What he got from the G7 and from NATO was a commitment to stick the course for as long as it takes. And that's what we're going to do.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister's remarks at the NATO summit were reported last week, the 2.5% commitment to spend on defence appeared to be really quite solid. His remarks today are less so. So assuming it is a commitment, can I just ask him, is it a commitment? And secondly, how are we going to pay for it? Because you have to have a credible plan to pay for it. Are we going to put up taxes? Or are we going to reduce expenditure in other areas to deliver what is a welcome and important commitment to the defence of the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a straightforward protraction of a prediction based on what we are currently committed to spending under the AUKUS programme and under the FCAS programme as well. These are gigantic commitments. I think they're the right thing for the UK. They will take us up to that threshold. Of course, it much depends on the size of our GDP at the time, Mr. Speaker. Much depends on the growth in the economy. And he asked how we're going to pay for it. I think we're going to pay for it out of steady and sustained economic growth, as I said to the gentleman opposite.
Joanna Churry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northern Irish Protocol Bill, the Legacy and Reconciliation Bill and the Bill of Rights are all bills which numerous informed commentators and cross-party committees of this House have said threaten to breach our international treaty obligations. And I note he indicated to the Leader of the Opposition that some of his interlocutors last week at least had raised these issues with him. And all of us who've travelled abroad in parliamentary business recently will have had these issues raised with us. So can he tell us exactly what concerns were raised with him over the last week about his government's disrespect for the international rule of law and human rights, and what he's going to do about it?
Prime Minister.
I can tell that the Honourable Lady absolutely categorically, not a single person said that the UK was in breach of international law. On the contrary, what they did say was that we were helping the world to stand up against breaches of international law.
Mercer.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister should absolutely be congratulated on defence spending and what he's done on it. Whilst many in his position previously have talked about it, actually this is the biggest increase since the end of the Cold War. But would he confirm to me that no directive has been issued from Number 10 or the Treasury on defence numbers, on numbers of personnel, and that will continue to be the case going forward should the situation continue to change?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I think he speaks wisely on this matter, which he knows very, very well, and we keep the actual numbers under constant review. The most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is to have our troops are the best in the world, but they've also got to have the best equipment in the world, and that's what we're paying for.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, sir. I was relieved to see the G7 recognise that 200 million people now face starvation around the world, along with the pledge to mobilise $100 billion in IMF special drawing rights to help alleviate the crisis. Last week, however, the Foreign Secretary couldn't tell us how much the UK has been given in special drawing rights, nor what her target was for sharing them back, presumably because it wasn't on Instagram. So can the Prime Minister help us? Can he reassure us that all 19 billion of the UK's new special drawing rights will be shared to help with this crisis in order to set a good example to the rest of the world?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to the use of special drawing rights, and we are supportive of using those for the benefit of people who are currently finding things very, very tough around the world.
I strongly support the government commitment to 2.5% and the Prime Minister's hint at this question time that we may go further than that in the years to come. But would he not agree with me, nonetheless, that the last year's integrated review talked about cutting conventional forces, tanks, aircraft, and people put boots on the ground, and that one of the lessons of Ukraine is we must not do that? Will he once again look at the commitments we have made to cutting, particularly our infantry, and think again about it?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I know that my honourable friend has military experience himself, but what we're learning from Ukraine what we're learning from Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, is that the vital importance of having troops, having a military operation that has a 360-degree protection and has the best possible equipment. And that is a lesson that I think the Russians are learning to their cost themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will have heard the deep concern across both sections of this House, particularly in response to his answers to the member from Bournemouth and the member from Leeds about the grain in Ukraine and the issue of world hunger and poverty. And he said there in his response that he was talking about the possibility of seeking a solution that may not have the consent of the Russians. So for avoidance of doubt, can he confirm to this House if he is looking at breaching the Montreux Agreement about larger forces in the Black Sea, please?
I thank her very much, and she's right to raise that. No, we're not looking at that. There are alternative solutions that don't involve the presence of UK or other warships in the Black Sea, though they might involve a tougher approach. But I think what we're also looking at is the possibility of using the rivers, using the Danube in particular, to try to get using the railways, to try to get the grain out in smaller quantities than we would be able to do with a giant convoy through giant maritime convoy through the Black Sea. So we're looking at all the possible options, including smaller packets of grain coming out that way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend stated Ukraine must have the strength to finish this war in the way President Zelensky described. Are we confident that all our allies are being as involved and supportive as the UK has been and continues to be for as long as it takes?
Prime Minister.
I think the answer to that is yes, Mr. Speaker, because every time we go to one of these summits and we think that the alliance is friable and that the strength of the pro-Ukrainian coalition is weak, actually people gravitate towards the centre and towards what the UK is saying, basically because there's no alternative. Putin isn't offering any kind of deal. President Zelensky can't do any kind of land for peace deal. There's no other option for us but to continue to support the Ukrainians in the way that we are. And that's why the unity remains so compelling.
Christian Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely understand that the sanctions regime so far has focused on the Russian elite, travel bans, for example, bans on export of luxury goods, as well as Russian hydrocarbons that earn them so much foreign exchange money. But as my honourable friend from Rhondda said, is it not now the time, as this war continues into the longer term, that we look at the Russian money that is still sloshing around in the UK and assume that if somebody has made a large amount of money in Putin's Russia, the chances are it's dodgy, and start to tighten that domestic sanctions regime?
Prime Minister.
He's of course right that we've got to keep tightening the noose the whole time. The Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill will help give us new powers to seize crypto assets, new powers over money laundering. But one thing I think that he would have spotted at the G7, I think was very important, was the new sanctions on Russian gold, which I mentioned in my statement. 13.5 billion pounds worth of sanctions on Russian gold. That will hit them.
Build up, Bim Afaloma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Prime Minister said about working with other countries to reduce the price of oil and gas. That's critical in this country, indeed across the world. Could he give the House a bit more detail on how we've been working with other countries, particularly in the Commonwealth, on investing in renewable energy, which is clean, safe and secure and reduces our dependence on hydrocarbons over the medium term?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. And the answer is that we're making massive investments as UK in Commonwealth countries, but as the G7, as I said, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is there specifically to help developing countries around the world to move forwards, to make the leap ahead to green technology and take investment from the UK and not perhaps from others who are busier in getting them to pay their debts.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened carefully to the Prime Minister's warm words about the Commonwealth and the relationship between independent countries. And of course, in 1941, it was then Prime Minister Churchill that signed the Atlantic Charter with the United States, committing both Britain and the United States to delivering people's right to choose their own form of government and self-government. This respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples was incorporated into the United Nations Charter in paragraph 2 of Articles 1, 73 and 76. In light of this, can the Prime Minister set out what mandate he has won which allows him to breach this UN principle, deny Scotland's claim of right and hold Scotland's democracy hostage?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I know that the First Minister has asked for another referendum. I just point out that we had one in 2014. I think right now the priorities of the country should be rebuilding after COVID. They should be taking us forward together as a united country, and that's what we want to do.
Sir Edward Lee.
Ukraine is by far the most important issue facing us, not least in terms of preventing mass starvation in Africa. One can't help noticing that unlike all the other fluff in the newspapers every day, nobody dares criticise the Prime Minister's resolute leadership on Ukraine. But what concerns many of us is that some of our allies don't seem to be as resolute as he, that whilst they will give full support to Ukraine not to lose this war, they're not that keen on Ukraine winning this war because they don't want to humiliate Putin. So can the Prime Minister make clear that it is the absolute commitment of NATO to defeat Putin once and for all?
Minister.
I agree 100% with what my right honourable friend has said, just with one clarification, which is it is 100% the objective of NATO and all our friends and allies to make sure that Putin fails in Ukraine. And I think it's very, very important that we frame it in that way, Mr. Speaker. And he can and he will, Mr. Speaker, because the Ukrainians won't have it any other way.
Very good.
Rwanda and the UK hosted the Keeping 1.5 Alive event in Kigali. But at the same time, the latest IPCC report said that the requirement, the opportunity to keep within 1.5 had now shifted forward from 2032 to 2025. Given that most major emitters in the G7 are not actually even meeting their Paris commitments made 7 years ago, what realistic chance does the Prime Minister believe there is that the G7 will step up to the plate in the next 3 years and achieve that turning down of emissions?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and if he looked at the G7 communique, he will have seen there was an explicit reference to making sure that anything we did was within our COP26 commitments to keeping 1.5 alive and to the commitments made under Paris.
Crispin Blood.
Mr. Speaker, can I strongly welcome this statement from the Prime Minister and say that in my time in the House, I can't recall a foreign affairs statement in which the serving Prime Minister could take more personal satisfaction than the one he has just delivered to the House. That his leadership of NATO and getting the very welcome conclusions of the NATO summit then only reinforce what the Leader of the Opposition said, that what Mr. Putin wants is for us to lose focus. Will he sustain his focus, get the grain out of Ukraine for the desperate need of the rest of the world, and ensure Ukraine's survival as a sovereign state?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and that certainly remains the objective of the government. But I stress that this is what we're doing to support the Ukrainians. It's not just a right in itself, Mr. Speaker, which everybody accepts. It's also right for the world, and that's why it continues to be supported around the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The NATO summit rightly identified that Russia and China challenge our security. China continues to make it clear the territories that they dispute in the Indo-Pacific. As war rages in Ukraine, concerns for the West's ammunition stockpiles are growing, and the Prime Minister is continuing with plans that will see capability gaps in our Navy, less planes, less tanks and less troops. Without a drastic rethink of these cuts, how realistic is the UK's desire in the integrated review to have a presence in both the North Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, what our friend, at the Commonwealth summit, the most interesting thing was the widespread understanding of what the UK is doing in the Indo-Pacific tilt. And the moves we're making to engage with that part of the world, to strengthen our friends and allies in that region. You saw what, Mr. Speaker, what we did with the Carrier Strike Group, absolutely astonishing exercise, and there are, you know about the AUKUS commitment that we've made, Mr. Speaker, and we're opening embassies in that part of the world and increasing our deployments there as well.
Robert Jenry.
Mr. Speaker, the single most impactful thing that we could do now to bear down on the cost of living would be to encourage OPEC, and in particular Saudi Arabia, to pump more oil. What is the government going to do to encourage our partners like Saudi Arabia to do that? The Saudi Arabian oil minister recently said that the relationship between Saudi and Moscow is as warm as the weather in Riyadh, a provocative statement probably influenced by our continued negotiation with Iran on a nuclear deal. Is this something that the United Kingdom government could take a lead on?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much. And look, he's right about the role of Saudi. I mean, there may be some question about quite how much more the Saudis could pump out at this particular moment, Mr. Speaker, but there's no doubt that we are going to need a lot more OPEC plus oil. And I think the answer is to continue. The UK, as you know, Mr. Speaker, has strong and productive relations with Saudi Arabia. We need to make sure that the whole of the West does as well, and we make that point to the Saudis. But that is the way forward. They need to produce more oil, no question.
British Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I say to the Prime Minister that there's some good stuff in what he's reported, and he should be applauded for that. But there are other things that are deeply worrying and concerning. First of all, that I come from a kind of military family. I saw little of my father until I was 6 because he was away serving the Royal Engineers during the war. But can I tell you, I take a real interest in the size of our army. And over the last 10 years, I have consistently said to ministers and prime ministers that dipping below 100,000 serving men and women is dangerous and foolish. And now, whatever the warm words have been this morning, the fact is his government is still committed to going down to 72,000 men and women, and that is not enough to fully protect our country. Will he think again about the size and power of our army?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. And look, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I perfectly understand why he speaks as he does, but the reality is that the UK army, the army alone, will have a whole force of over 100,000. That's 73,000 plus 30,000 reserves, Mr. Speaker. And the key test is what are they doing and how are they equipped? How are they protected? And they are the best in the world, but we also want to make sure that we give them the best possible equipment. And that's what we're doing. If you look at listen to the Ukrainians, they will tell you that our equipment is the best.
Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said the world has seen the United Kingdom stand up for what is right in Ukraine. That is standing up for freedom, liberty and human rights. Tying that question also to the Commonwealth. The Prime Minister has said they were concerned by some in the Commonwealth with regards to their narrative of what Russia was doing in the Ukraine. At the same time, in the Commonwealth, there are a number of those countries who are also listed in the World Watch List 2022 with regards to their record on freedom of religion or belief. Was there any discussion on that? Because tomorrow, the United Kingdom is hosting the Ministerial on freedom of religion or belief, which I had a pledge to sign off in my time as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy. I know he's committed to this area. Was there any discussion on how we can advance freedom of religion or belief in the Commonwealth?
I thank him very much. Can I first of all thank my honourable friend very much for everything he did as envoy for freedom of religion and belief. And I think it was at least partly thanks to his energy and efforts, Mr. Speaker, that we have a global conference in this city next week on freedom of belief around the world. And I can tell them that one of the many things that unite the Commonwealth is a passionate determination to protect that freedom.
Mr. Speaker, clamping down on Putin's cronies and their money, far too little too late, but nevertheless we're getting there, I think has been one of the positives of this war so far. I'm glad to hear the Prime Minister say he's committed to the Economic Crime Bill 2 and all the measures in it, but there's one aspect I want to ask him on specifically. Golden visas. 4 years ago, the review into golden visas was promised. It's not been delivered. Why?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to her. We are doing everything we can to make sure that we restrict access by Putin's cronies or anybody who supports the invasion of Ukraine to this country, and that's why we are reviewing the golden visa scheme.
Rick Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's clear the whole House welcomes the strong role that the UK played in driving support for Ukraine. Will the Prime Minister update us on the discussions that he had with Prime Minister Kishida of Japan, particularly on the progress on the UK's participation in the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement and also cooperation on science and technology?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. I also thank him for his role as the UK's envoy for trade with Japan. I can tell them the opportunities are absolutely immense, and the government of Fumio Kishida is determined to progress the alliance with the UK to new heights. And he's absolutely right to talk about science and technology. Mr. Speaker, as he knows, that we've just lifted barriers to trade with Japan, but what we're also looking at is a partnership with Japan in defence technology that I think could be the foundation of immense future progress, particularly on science and technology.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no doubt about the strength of support for NATO and the G7 for this defence of Ukraine, this defence of the legitimate the freedom of the people of Ukraine. But there are also credible reports that it is now becoming increasingly difficult to get weaponry and ammunition across the globe. That now the Defence Secretary is shaking his head. These are reports. Was this raised at all at NATO? And can we guarantee that that supply of armaments, the supply of ammunition, will be available?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his. He makes a very interesting point. The UK, as he knows, began the Ramstein process, where countries commit substantial sums and as well as materiel to Ukraine. I'm not aware of any logistical problems that we're facing so far. I have to tell the honourable gentleman we are still seeing great progress in getting arms into Ukraine, but there's a lot more to do.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was 3 months ago to the day yesterday that a refugee mother and a little boy came to live with my family in North Norfolk, in my home. 3 months seems an incredibly long time now. It has gone in a shot. I want to say now that those family that came to live with me, they are terrified at still returning to Kyiv. The only hope that there is the announcement by the government that we will stand there at the request of President Zelensky to champion the rebuilding of their city of Kyiv. And that will bring enormous hope to all those refugees who have fled Ukraine. Will the Prime Minister tell me now, so I can give some reassurance to all those families, and indeed the ones that live with me now, that we as a country will not give up? We certainly will not be negotiating with Putin, as some would have us do, and that we will stand firm with the people of Ukraine to make sure the Russians are expelled from their sovereign country, and then, by golly, bit by bit, we will help those people rebuild their country.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank him first very much for his kindness to the family from Ukraine. I know that is being done by many other colleagues around the chamber, and I thank everybody for what they're doing. I think it's a great scheme, and it is much appreciated by the Ukrainians. Actually, thanks to the support that we've been giving the Ukrainians, they're starting to see some large numbers going back to Ukraine. Of the 7 million who left, at least 3 and a bit million have now gone back, which is good news. We want them all to be able to go back safely. Mr. Speaker, we want them to go back safely to their entire country, Mr. Speaker, and then we want the UK to be in the lead, as we already are in the Kiev region, in rebuilding Ukraine.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were some very welcome agreements reached in Madrid, not least the doubling of battle groups on the eastern flank, the massive expansion of the NATO response force, and of course the endorsement of Sweden and Finland as members. But I wonder if the Prime Minister agrees that our success is underpinned by the maintenance of public support for the war in Ukraine, and can he say how he, and also President Biden, plan to maintain that public support is maintained for as long as is necessary?
Prime Minister.
I think that's a very... I know that he's served in the armed forces himself, and he understands how difficult it can be to continue to build public support for military expenditure. But it is absolutely vital that we do this. The cost of allowing Ukraine simply to fall to Putin, to be crushed, to be engulfed, would be immense. And it wouldn't just be a political catastrophe, it would be an economic catastrophe as well, because he wouldn't stop there, and the instability and the economic damage would continue for generations.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Nationalists would cut our defence spending to 1.6% and indeed unilaterally disarm if they were ever to achieve independence. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that our new ambition to spend 2.5% and also our rock-solid commitment to NATO shows, as a guarantor of our security, why Scotland is better off in the UK?
Prime Minister.
Right, Mr. Speaker, I know I hesitated to say that to my right honourable friend opposite. He's my friend, by the way, Mr. Speaker. He's much that he did. But that is the fact. The Scottish contribution to our armed services is immense. Everybody knows it. It's a fantastic thing. It helps to make the UK what it is. It would be utterly tragic for the whole world, Mr. Speaker, if the UK armed services were to face a division of that kind, or a loss of that kind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When he was in Rwanda, did he meet with the leader of the opposition, Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza, who spent 8 years in prison for simply criticising the regime in Rwanda? And did he speak to President Kagame about his continual policy of criminalising or assassinating his political opponents?
No problem, no. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I did raise human rights concerns with President Kagame. I raised issues of freedom of speech, but I think I'm sure he's been to Rwanda himself. He will know that that's a country that in 1994 underwent perhaps the most catastrophic, humiliating disaster that any country could undergo. And whatever he may say about President Kagame, he has brought that country back from the brink, and he has done, I think, an immense service to his country in restoring order, which his people value immensely.
Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister was right when he said recently that 2% of defence spending should be a floor, not a ceiling. However, some of our allies are still in the basement when it comes to meeting their NATO commitments. So can the Prime Minister outline what efforts were made to specifically rectify this in Madrid?
I thank him very much, and I can tell him that what the UK has been doing is leading by example. So it was at Cardiff in 2014 when we set the target of 2% of GDP, a floor, not a ceiling. We exceeded it, one of the first to exceed it. 8 other countries are now exceeding it. But what you're seeing around the table is countries absolutely determined now to follow suit and to spend more. And I would single out what Olaf Scholz has been doing in Germany. Quite remarkable change of events in Germany.
Okay.
That was a very clumsy attempt to unseat the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth. It was hardly good statescraft, Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
It was a great day for democracy, Mr. Speaker, and that's the lesson that among the many things that the Commonwealth stands for in the world. And I think that Patricia Scotland will do an excellent job for the next 2 years, and she will get every possible support.
Richard Holden.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, a recent visit to the IPU conference and also the Council of Europe, it's widely acknowledged that the Prime Minister has not just been leading Europe but also leading world leaders in his response to Ukraine. can I ask him two questions? Because there are other countries who are really on the front line who are doing a huge amount. That's Poland and Romania. And one of the issues we've seen in shipments of grain is the possibility of the use of the port of Constanta for grain shipments. And I was wondering if the Prime Minister's had any dealings with the President of Romania around how we can do that to ensure that global food prices are protected.
Prime Minister.
My old friend makes an excellent point, and that he alludes to exactly the kind of solutions that we're trying to find, Mr. Speaker, in the event that we are forced to do an operation that does not involve the consent of the Russians, as I think is all too likely.
Margaret Fourier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During his conversations at the G7 and NATO summits, what was made of the risk of antagonising China through the UK government's trade talks with Taiwan? And does the Prime Minister agree that the UK must respect Taiwanese sovereignty and show that to China?
Ray Marshall. Prime Minister.
I think, Mr. Speaker, what the G7 and this is where the discussion was probably liveliest on that subject. What the G7 feel is that China's a gigantic fact of our lives, and we've got to understand that, and everybody's got huge trading relations with China. But on the other hand, there are lots of areas where you've got to compete, you've got to contest, and sometimes to challenge what China does. And that was very much agreed around the table at the G7 and indeed at NATO.
I'll go long.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituents of Dudley North are indeed very proud of the actions taken by this country and by this Prime Minister in supporting Ukraine, its armed forces, and indeed the victims of Russian aggression in Ukraine. However, my constituents, as are the public purse at the moment, feeling the pinch in their pocket, and the public purse is under severe pressure as well. So they also want to know that our NATO allies and immediate neighbours are also playing their part in equal measure.
I thank him very much. And if he looks at the table of expenditure, the US is way out in front. And I really congratulate Joe Biden on his leadership. The Americans have really stepped up to the plate. Fantastic effort by Joe Biden and the Americans. We're spending the second biggest amount. I think the Poles are actually in third place, Mr. Speaker. And then there's a long tail of others. But, you know, everybody is now spending more and more. And what we agreed is that we're in it for the long haul. And that was the most important thing.
We now bring in Paul Holmes.
Mr. Speaker, that was great exercise, bobbing, I can tell you. The Prime Minister should be congratulated for his international leadership on Ukraine, and that should be shown by how much people in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government applaud him for his leadership at NATO. In relation to his meetings at NATO, we're now entering a phase where the Ukrainians really do now need to start being able to push the Russian lines back. So what conversations has he had about supplying heavier land-based equipment to the Ukrainians going forward?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right. That is where the focus now is. The Ukrainians are heroic. They've shown they can push the Russians back. They pushed them from Kiev. They pushed them back from Kharkiv. What they need is the right multiple launch rocket systems to do it, because the Russians are very good at standing off and using heavy artillery to shell and intimidate. So the MLRS are absolutely critical for the Ukrainian fight back. That's what we're giving them now, together with several other allies. But what they also need is the training to make sure that those very sophisticated weapons are used to the best possible effect, and we're giving them that training as well. Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his statement and answering questions today. Thank you.
Point of order.
Point of order, Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. My constituent is a sponsor for a mother and daughter in Ukraine at the moment. They applied for a Homes for Ukraine sponsorship scheme visa on the 10th of April. The mother's visa was approved on the 10th of June, but there is still no visa for her 16-year-old daughter, Maria. Their nearest city is currently under rocket fire, and they are desperate to leave for their safety. My team have contacted the Home Office 4 times, twice in person, but Maria's visa is being held up inexplicably. I seek your advice in how to resolve this.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for giving notice of her point of order, and I can understand her concerns as she has voiced them today. Whilst it's clearly not the responsibility of the Chair, but she has put her concerns on the record, and I'm sure that ministers will have heard them, and I hope a speedy resolution is forthcoming, and I'm asking the Treasury Whip to make sure, and he's doing it as I'm speaking. So thank you very much. Point of order, Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As you know, in order to get an oral question on the order paper, you have to submit as a backbench member to the ballot process. And every day, hundreds and hundreds of MPs fail. And in fact, we nearly always fail. But just occasionally, we have that little moment of joy when an email comes through saying, your question has been successful in the ballot for such and such. And I got 2 for this week. 1 tomorrow for justice questions on screening for brain injury in prisons. You would have thought directly responsibility of the Justice Department. And on Thursday, 1 on artists' resale right. You would have thought that artists were a responsibility of the Culture Department. Unfortunately, both those departments have decided to transfer those away, which means I won't get an oral answer. I won't get an opportunity to ask a supplementary question. Now, I don't know whether this is because they're frightened of answering questions from me, or whether they just want it shunted off to some other department. But can you just confirm that that ministers on the whole shouldn't be doing this? On the whole, it's better if you've got through the ballot process just to let it happen. And secondly, that either the minister themselves can overturn this decision and reinstate the question for tomorrow and for Thursday, or Mr. Speaker could choose to catch my eye, or the other way round.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable member for giving notice of the point of order. Now, the transfer of questions, as he says, is a matter for ministers, not the Chair. And I appreciate that members may be disappointed to lose their slot, and in your case, slots, at question time if their oral question is transferred. Where questions relate to matters for which more than one minister is responsible, or where responsibility is ambiguous, I expect ministers to be very cautious about transferring oral questions. The Table Office is always able to provide advice to members on these issues, and there again, I'm sure that the Treasury bench will have heard what the honourable member has had to say. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill Committee.
Now. Members may wish to note that a manuscript government new clause and manuscript government amendments to improve the drafting of amendments agreed in committee on day 1 have been tabled for consideration at report stage. These manuscript amendments are now available in the vote office. Order.